welcome you to our final gathering of this year. We have been so excited about the PI gatherings that we've had thus far. And for those of you who have been able to participate since the beginning, as you know, we've had a wonderful mix of good quality information, but then also good time to be together to figure out how do we make this information applicable, right? We don't just want to know things, we want to be able to apply things. And so I'm so excited to have Andrew with us. He is the person who is going to take us from the information that we heard in our last session on, what was it, November 1st, and to bring us into how do we start to apply that information in our own congregations. And that is super exciting. A little bit about Andrew. Andrew is currently a postdoctoral research associate at Baylor University. He received his PhD from Florida State University, writing on the history and the development of theological education in the United States. Andrew holds research interests in American religious history, theological education, congregational studies, religion and race, and spatial theory. He has published articles in Cross Currents, the American Baptist Quarterly, Baptist History and Heritage, and Implicit Religion. And of course, we are super excited about the fact that he is the author of Reimagining Zion, a history of the Alliance of Baptists that was published in 2015. He also currently serves on the board of directors of the Alliance. And so we are super excited to have him here with us. I will say he may not know this, but Andrew is someone who works with endorsement. When we have people who are fairly new to the Alliance who are coming to be endorsed by us, we always recommend that they purchase your book so they can read more and have a better understanding of what it means to be a part of the Alliance. So we are super excited to have you with us. Before we hear from Andrew, the next voice that you will hear this evening will be for Miss Leslie Hergert. I did not practice how to pronounce your last name. Correct me if I did that wrong. And she is going to be leading us.
Great.
Say it again.
Good. That was perfect.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right. Well, then she will be leading us for our opening devotion, and you will hear from her in just a moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malu. Paula asked me to read this and to tell you a little about the Advent devotional that Old Cambridge Baptist Church developed this year. And we used a model that Pastor Cody Sanders had started with us in 2016 when we engaged in a year of dismantling white supremacy. We did not dismantle it, just so you know. We worked hard though. So this year we decided that we would do it again. And the model is that we asked members of the congregation to each take a day, and our team chose Bible readings from the lectionary. We chose things that were not kind of the basic story generally, but we picked things from the different lectionary readings and then just pretty much randomly assigned them to people who volunteered. So we had 23 people from the congregation who agreed to write something. We gave them a format, which was the Bible verses first, and then their own meditation on it through the lens of race, and then a prayer and a question. I'm a little embarrassed to read my own, but Paula asked me to do that. We have members in our congregation who are very theologically trained, and we have others who are not, and I'm one of those who is not. So here's my reading. So this is from portions of Psalms 14 and 15. Our great God is forever searching for those who live their lives for him. He is not looking for verbal professions alone, but for active living testimonies of faith. Your child, O Lord, walks cautiously and in obedience to your precepts and principles. He is open and honest before God and people. She speaks and acts in love toward her neighbor. He cannot condone that which is evil and doesn't participate in that which promotes injustice. She listens to her sister's griefs and complaints. He seeks to lighten his brother's burden and to share in his sorrow and pain. She reaches out to heal rather than hurt, to be kind and gentle to all who cross her path. Those who demonstrate this loving relationship with God and his human creatures manifest participation in his kingdom. They will never be separated from the family of God. So here's my meditation. This psalm reads like an instruction manual, a guide to how to be a good person. In fact, every member of this church fits the description. Speak and act in love, check. Avoid promoting injustice, check. Seek to lighten our friends' burdens, check. So how does this help us with racism? It doesn't really, because racism is about more than niceness. Racism is built into our culture, our thinking, our worldview. We at OCBC have learned enough from recent years of preaching and study groups to know this is true. But because racism is implicit, built in, embedded, it's often difficult to see, and especially to see in ourselves and our own thinking and behavior. Because our communities are racially separated, most of us white people have limited interactions across races. When I worked, I had more cross-racial relationships than I do now. I go to a predominantly white church, live in a predominantly white neighborhood, have predominantly white friends. At work, I had the corrective of cross-racial discussions to confront my own limited thinking and be able to address specific contextualized injustices. Now I'm often at a loss about how and where to address racism, and I may not even see the racism in my own interactions. So my prayer that I hope you'll join me in. Oh God, I know you are looking for active living testimonies of faith. Help me to explore more deeply where and how racialized thinking and assumptions affect and infect my actions. Help me to find ways out of the paralysis of overthinking, to be able to take action where I can and seek ways to bring healing in the part of the world I walk through. And my question for reflection is, what is my role in addressing racism in myself and the world I inhabit, my church, work, and community? How can I do better?
Amen, and thank you. I completely understand why Paula asked you to read that. And thank you for leaving us with those important questions. At this time, you will now hear from Andrew. I just wanted to make one quick disclaimer I forgot to say. Please leave yourselves on mute. So it's very important that when you're not talking, you be on mute. That way, background noises. If you hear something that you like, you can mention it in the chat, or you can use your reaction buttons. I used this one earlier for Leslie because I was excited that she was reading it. So I did the woo celebration. So just remember that we can still have some call and response in Zoom land with our reaction button and with the chat feature. Okay, Andrew, I am going to pin you now and take it away, sir. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Malou. Thank you, Thrive team. And thank you, Leslie, for that wonderful reflection to get us started. Can you all see my screen? And the prophetic imagination, knowing your church's past, bringing justice.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful to be able to speak with you all this evening and kind of share some of what I've learned over the past few years working in a number of contexts, some alliance contexts, some with the Baptist Joint Committee, looking at kind of institutions and specifically Baptist institutions and how their history has often perpetuated white supremacy in ways of thinking about how can the investigation of history help untangle those systems of white supremacy and bring institutions into an alignment with more of an anti-racist agenda. And so I'm really grateful. We're in the brief time that I'm speaking with you all tonight. Let me get my timer on so I don't go too long. I'm going to talk a little bit about general thinking about how we understand what history is and how history can help us, and then move into some really concrete actions that I think churches can take to try and start some of this investigation of their history to see how their history intersects with systems of white supremacy that have so long been a part of Euro-American culture. And so with that, I'd like to start with a little bit of thinking about history in a really broad sense, ideas of right history and wrong history. I find right history and wrong history is something that we get in a little bit of a binary over the past decade, we might say. And I think sometimes this complicates our view of what history is actually doing and how history actually works. And so from my perspective, I have a couple ideas of what history is and what history is not. And so what history is for myself in thinking about this, it's a discipline. It's not just the past. We might say that this discipline is one that's geared at change over time, that is analyzing how change over time has happened. Some histories may look at a really small section of time. Some may look at a really broad scope of time. But history is not just the past. It's not just a chronicle of things that have happened. It's something that's more dynamic than that, which gets us to some of these other ideas. So history is evolving. It's something that's constantly changing, that historians from 40, 50 years ago would not recognize the conversation that historians are having today in 2022. So it's not a static thing. It's not something that, once a history is written, it's set in stone, we've got it, we're good, we can move on. A lot of times we think of history as being something that is just in the past, that's static, that we have to go and pull out what we want. It's not that simple. It's more evolving. Our perspectives change as different models of interpretation come to light. We may think about history in different ways. And so building upon that, history is multifaceted. I was trained in a religious studies program studying American religious history, but I did take some courses in a strictly history department. And when you talk with historians that are very just history minded, they will argue back and forth over whether or not a history is a social history, if is it an economic history, or is it a political history? Is it a cultural history? There are different types of histories, and it's not just singular. There are different ways of interpreting history. Some individuals may be really focused on intellectual history versus kind of thinking in just a broad scope. From my own discipline, Sidney Alstrom wrote A People's History of or a religious history of the American people in 1972, which is a doorstop. It's about 1,100, 1,200 pages. He tries to get everything in there. No one since has tried, not because I think everyone thinks Sidney Alstrom did it and it was perfect. I think they thought that mission of doing something that was just a singular holistic history was a failed project to begin with. You could only get so surface level and not very deep. So history is multifaceted. It's not singular. And lastly, I think it's argumentative and purposeful. There's an argument that historians are making. This is not just going to see what happened in the past. It's attempting to make an argument about why things are the way they are. And in that line, in that vein, history is not the capital T truth. The way I think about this is if your congregation were to ask someone to write a history for your congregation, and they spent a long time going into the archives, going into, talking to members of the church, getting oral history, looking at sources outside the church, and they came back with a history that everyone thought was perfect. One, that would never happen, but say everyone thought it was perfect. Everyone thought every element of this book gets everything right. This is the truth of our church. You would not then go burn all the other sources that they used because you had this book, this history of your church that was the capital T truth. You'd keep those archives for what will come next. So that's what I mean in terms of thinking about history as not being capital T truth, not being static, not being singular. That even when you investigate your history and find a good interpretation, you don't get rid of the sources, because years later you may want to come back to them and interpret history in new light. And so as a result of that being argumentative and purposeful, I think there's a way in which our investigations of history can be geared towards anti-racism. And when I think about doing this work, I'm always coming back to Ibram X. Kendi's ideas of anti-racism and definitions of racism and anti-racist and anti-racist, that Kendi will write, a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, or expressing a racist idea. Whereas an anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So I think in terms of this as being policy-oriented, being argumentative, purposeful, there's a policy that Kendi is really concerned about when we think about what is racist and what is anti-racist. And I think for myself, in thinking about Leslie's reflection about where do we intersect with that, as a historian, I have found, for me in a lot of ways, using my skills as a historian to unearth those policies, to be able to bring those policies to light, how they were constructed within our institutions, how they are glossed over within our institutions or not recognized. That I think history is a powerful tool in being able to investigate whether or not how policies, racist policies, come to be in our settings. And so with this idea of thinking about history as something that can engage in racism, anti-racism, being purposeful, argumentative, I'm going to ask some participation. If you all could write in the chat, I'm going to ask you a question. I ask undergrads this all the time whenever I teach historical courses, to get to this idea of history being argumentative. I want you to write one date, 4 numbers. It could be a different number, a year. If you want to go far further back, you can too. But when would you say the United States, the history of the United States begins? What date would you say is when the history of the United States began? Type those into your chat. I'm curious to see what numbers come up for you all. 1619, great, thanks. 1776, 1491, yeah. 1619, 1789, 1541. Okay, great. Coming in, I can't read them so fast. Perfect. This is great. Yeah. All of these are good answers for thinking about that question. I think this also speaks to the fact that history is not singular, that when we think about when we're going to start the history of the United States, there are multiple ways in which we can think about that start. And so a number of you wrote dates in there that I think make sense coming up: 1491, 1492, these dates in terms of when we start to see Europeans discovering what they consider the New World, the Americas. But other dates that have come up a lot more recently, you have the 1619 project, starting the United States in 1619, when 20 and odd enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of the United States. And that project by Nicole Hannah-Jones that really shows in ways in which the history of the United States kind of begins at this point in time. As a Virginian, I grew up thinking 1607, when Jamestown was settled. That this would be the time period in which we would say the start of the United States happens. Jill Lepore is a great scholar who would say 1675. So looking at King Philip's War, that this is the origins of what she says in that book is American identity, looking at the ways in which the conflict between indigenous and settler, that war between indigenous and settlers in 1675 helped create the identity of what we think of as Americans in the United States sense. And then we have, other individuals who will say 1776, that for all those dates prior to 1776, there's no such thing as the United States, that if we're talking about when the United States begins, we would say 1776. And it's not that any of these dates are wrong or right. It's the type of argument that's put forward behind them. I think that's significant. And thinking about whether or not these dates are obscuring policies of racism, or they're exposing those policies of racism for the purposes of changing those policies. So when we think about the 1619 Project, we would think about something that is trying to reveal those racist policies, to unearth them, to kind of give way to more anti-racist policies and anti-racist histories. Whereas when we think about the 1776 Project, that was unleashed in the final couple months of the Trump administration, as being something that's more looking to kind of obscure the elements of race that are present in America's foundings. And so there's a purposeful nature to this. I wouldn't say that the 1776 Project is wrong. I'd just say that it's bad. It is not one that is showing the fullness of historical inquiry, that is really accounting for all different sides of what's happening in the United States at that point in time. And so with this idea of thinking about origins, getting into some of the more practical elements of what I think congregations, a starting place might be, is to think about your beginning questions about where and when your congregation came to be. That these beginning questions are going to really shape the types of questions you ask about your congregation, the types of policies that your congregation may have inadvertently been supporting, the ways in which your congregations may have been wrapped up in white supremacy, that where you set your beginning questions are going to set the types of questions that you should think about for investigating your congregation's history. And so, the way I think about that in terms of the when, if your congregation was founded in the 1750s or even the 1850s, you're going to be thinking about questions of race a little bit differently than you're thinking about if your congregation was founded in the 1950s. So for a lot of Alliance congregations that are founded during that time period in the 1750s or 1850s, you're likely going to be in the South. You're likely going to be founded in a time in American history when slavery was prominent in the American South. And so your congregation undoubtedly engaged in questions of enslavement of African peoples. And so that's going to shape the type of questions you ask about your congregation, the types of things you want to begin to look at in your congregation, more so than if your congregation was founded in the 1950s. And so for a lot of Alliance congregations that are founded in the 1950s, many of them are Southern Baptist congregations that were founded in support of civil rights. So I've done some work on the history of Binkley Memorial Baptist Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And this is a congregation that fits that mold, that they're a church that's trying to be, for all intents and purposes, anti-racist in the 1950s, to try and found a congregation that was welcoming of Black members at a time when the other Baptist church in town was not welcoming of Black members. And so the questions that Binkley asks itself and the questions that congregations founded during this time for that purpose, those questions are going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be so much about thinking about origins. From my perspective, it's thinking about what happened post-civil rights. How did if your congregation was founded for the express purpose of being, anti-racist and supportive of the civil rights movement, what happened after 1968? What happened in the 1970s? Did you continue that work? Where did you drop the ball? That those are going to be questions that animate your congregation. And so The when is going to be an important component of this. Additionally, the where. And so the latest, I think this was the last group of Alliance congregations, their addresses that were sent to me a couple of months ago. I know we have some people on here that aren't in Alliance congregations, some that are in the Evergreen Association, Seattle, Oregon. I'm not sure where those congregations fit on here, but this is the latest list. So if you don't see your congregation, my apologies. I was just using the list I had. But this is the list of Alliance congregations. And where those congregations are going to inform the questions that you ask. If you're in the North, if you're in New England, the questions about how your congregation engages questions of racism and white supremacy are going to be different than if you are in the South. If you're in the Midwest, they're going to be different. You're going to have to engage more with the Great Migration in the early 20th century, more so if you're in perhaps the Midwest or a northern city than you would be if you're in the South. In the South, you're going to have to engage more with Jim Crow and other elements of American history. And so getting ahead of myself. So the when and where are important. So I think that's kind of the first step for congregations to take, of thinking about when their congregation was founded, where their congregation was founded, and what types of questions does that raise for you, just kind of off the top of your head. Moving further, I think getting into more generic questions about what's going on broader in American history over the course of your congregation's history, and what's going on in your local history. So you have your beginnings. Then start to think of bigger things that are happening within the history of the United States. So if you're one of those congregations that's in the 1750s, 1850s, during the period of enslavement in the United States, think about how your congregation is, slavery is going on. How might your congregation be engaging with slavery? What was the congregation's stance on the Civil War, Reconstruction? Start to think about events that are happening and try and find some dates that you might be able to have in your back pocket of questions you want to see. What was my congregation doing during this period or at this point in time? Also think about period of the Jim Crow South, white flight, period outside of white members moving out into the suburbs away from where their congregation was. Think of lynchings. So if you go to Lynching in America for the Equal Justice Initiative, you can see they've documented where lynchings are. Is your congregation in one of these shaded areas? You can find when those lynchings happened. You can have those dates to be like, I wonder what my congregation was doing during this time period. Did my congregation have anything to say? Did the pastor of my congregation have anything to say? Start to get these generic questions that you have big questions that you can form a list of. Civil rights. What was your congregation doing civil rights? Beyond that, more contemporary questions. How has your congregation responded to gun violence? You can think of a lot of period events in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s that you can come up with a list to be like, I wonder what my congregation was doing in the wake of Rodney King. I wonder what my congregation was doing in the wake of these events. You may have local historical events that come up. If you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Wilmington, North Carolina, these white race riots in those cities, that those would be moments of being able to say, I wonder what my congregation was doing. You can go to newspapers.com and you can kind of search some of this to try and find some of those local events. You can also search your congregation. But this first step, I think coming up with generic questions is most helpful. And following that, then I would recommend getting into some of your source material. That I think the reason I'm suggesting this is because it's really daunting when you go and you look at all the material your church might have. I grew up in a church that we had a historical room in our church. It had so much material in it that my mom coined it the hysterical room, that it was something that no one really ventured into because there was so much stuff. It seemed really overwhelming of how to go in, where to begin. And so by asking these generic questions, you have things that you can go look for in your source material. You can say, oh, this event happened at this date. I wonder what my church was doing at this date. You can go to your church. You can go to your church history. If someone's written a church history, they're oftentimes very detailed. They're more of a chronicle than they are of an argumentative history most of the time. But you can go and you can see if my congregation has a history, what was happening at that time? Do they mention anything? Look in church meeting minutes. Does it come up in any of the church meeting minutes? If you have sermons, you can look at sermons. Bulletins may not have some of this information, but they might. If there's particular liturgy or readings that are taking place that may be relevant. Letters, if you have any letters from pastoral staff to congregants may have letters. Church directories may be helpful. Oral histories, remembering this time, may be helpful. And denominational records. I have just a generic meeting minute from the Pike County Baptist Association in Arkansas, that you can find these minutes in archive.org. HathiTrust.org is another great site. But to go in and try and see what were Baptists in my area, what was my congregation doing, that I think the first step is these generic questions. The next step is going to these materials so you have something to go and look for. And then the task, as you're going to look for that, is trying to connect these generic historical questions with your local congregation's history. What was your congregation doing, saying, not saying? The specifics matter here. That I think there's a way in which we can look at, our congregation as being Baptist and go look in broad scopes of what Baptists are doing. It's important for congregations to look specifically at what their congregation was doing, because that's informing how their racist policies are created, unknowingly or knowingly. And so go back and look, what are the specifics that are that you're finding in response to these? Not saying anything is saying something, and it allows you to have something to latch onto. That from this, you can broaden your search out from these connections. That rather than going right into your church meeting minutes and saying, I'm going to start reading my minutes from the very beginning and move on through, you're going to get tired. You're not going to be able to really get the most out of your time just starting to reading church minutes from beginning to end. It's like when as a kid, I always wanted to start reading the Bible from beginning to end. By the time you hit Leviticus, you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. The same thing's going to happen with meeting minutes. Trust me. So having dates in your back pocket from generic historic questions to go into the source material from your church, that's going to help. And you can broaden your search out from there. Once you already have some connections and you've got some connections under your belt and you're confident that you can build out from there, you've got some wins of being able to understand what's going on in your congregation, you can begin to broaden out your search of seeing how this particular moment of racist action or inaction shapes the policy of your church. And then you can begin to search for patterns of, well, is this something that is continually not discussed in the congregation? Or does this come up at a later date? And how does it reference back to your church? And so getting to this idea of a purposeful history, once you feel like you've got a lot of connections of being able to see how these policies are being developed within your congregation, work to develop an argument. I know that sounds like a very college response to say, but history is not just an assortment of things that you find. You need to organize them into some sense of create some understanding, some argument of how your congregation has perpetuated systems of racism and white supremacy through active policy or inactive policy. Be broad and be specific. If there's not much your congregation is saying, again, that's saying something. Look at specifics. What are different members of your congregation, as so far as you can find them in the record, advocating? Engage BIPOC congregants in your congregation to hear what their thoughts are on this history. Engage local historians. Sometimes you may have a hysterical room that you don't know how to manage. find a local historian to come in. They'll love to help go through that material, I'm sure. And then as you develop your argument and begin to kind of paint a picture of how your congregation is thinking about this, think about what type of reparations or repairs that your congregation might make to reorient its priorities away from its past failures. Engage BIPOC congregants about this and community members. This is not something where this can be done in isolation. This is not just this is something that takes a whole community to kind of come together as to what are good responses to this history that you're uncovering, to this argument that you're making about your local church history.